And it is never too late to learn. It is never too late to sit and learn, because like Revelations indicates to us, these hymns are the things that we're going to be singing in heaven. So,
hey guys, welcome back to Keeping It 99, the most edifying podcast in the world. And I'm joined here today with Dr. Kyrollos Zare. Thank you, Dr. Zare, for coming onto the podcast.
it's my pleasure, Isaiah. It's just Kyrollos is fine.
Okay, so I just wanted to, let the viewers get to know you a little bit more. So tell me a little bit about who you are, your life, just a general get to know you.
So my name is Kyrollos Zare. A lot of people call me Zare. Was born and raised in St. Mary's East Brunswick Church in New Jersey. I guess went to Rutgers, New Brunswick. Went to medical school down in South Jersey, and then eventually went to pediatric residency to study to be a pediatrician. Am I supposed to do a fun fact on these things?
Sure, go for it.
Fun fact, I'm very scared of heights. So that's me in a nutshell.
Okay, sounds good. So thank you first off for coming onto the podcast. It's a blessing to have you on. And today's topic, we're talking about praise, specifically praise within the Coptic Church. So to get, obviously, to know you a little bit more, we want to ask, why did you want to talk about praise? What's that connecting to you personally? What would you say is like your personal connection with praise? You can either talk about a moment or a lifetime, whatever, up to you. What's your connection with praise?
I wouldn't say it's like just personally my connection. I think that the Coptic Church has a very, very intimate connection with praise. And I think it's like very good at speaking to its children about it. Personally, I know that there are some people in the church who some people are into like praise, some people are not. Some people kind of identify themselves with more like concrete things like Bible study, or like prayer meetings or things like that. I think that praise is just a very all-encompassing type thing. When I was younger, obviously my parents kind of pushed me towards church and things like that. And I used to, in my youth meeting on Friday nights, there used to be this servant, whom I will not name, but he would be one of the only servants there doing the midnight praises on Friday nights. I remember I would just stand there. I didn't really know anything, but I found it very engaging. The words were very engaging. Half the time they were singing in Coptic and I didn't understand, but I enjoyed it. Fast forward 5-10 years after that, I'm going to Tasbeha on my own, midnight praises on my own. And it's just a really unique experience. You're standing there in front of God, almost vulnerable. Sometimes you get emotional highs, and sometimes you're truly there's a palpable feeling in the air of when you're standing there and praising God in your vulnerable state as a human being, praising him for who he is. And that's, I think, the thing that I love the most about praise. It doesn't really have anything to do with me, Kyrollos, right? It doesn't have anything to do with the individual. It has everything to do with God. At times our mother, the church, will, sprinkle in some personal type prayers, where the Psalm will say, "My Lord Jesus Christ." But for the most part, it's really about God and about how awesome he is, and how much he deserves our love and praise.
I think you hit the head on the nail when you said at the end there, or hit the nail on the head. Wow. Hit the nail on the head when you said at the end that God is so deserving of that praise and of that glory. So kind of moving into that topic about the purpose of Tasbeha, what would you define as the purpose of Tasbeha and praise in the Coptic Orthodox Church?
My very humble opinion, I think it's a way for us to start to mimic the way that we will be praising in heaven. You know what I'm saying? In Revelations itself, it describes about how the angels praise with the praise of Moses the prophet. When the children of Israel were freed from the tyranny of the pharaohs, and escaped from the destruction of the Red Sea, right? That is literally in Revelations that the angels are praising that way. So it's the church has almost kind of set us up in a way saying at the beginning of the midnight praise, saying, "Arise, O children of the light," as if we're kind of entering into heaven. And so I feel, personally, some of the, one of the many reasons why the Coptic Church has given us praise as a gift, is for us to start to understand how we will be in heaven, so that we can begin our journey here on earth.
I think that's about opening into heaven. I think is a very good point, and I think as well that that I think the thing about Tasbeha that sets it apart from other church services is that you almost feel transcendent into heaven. Whereas within like the liturgy, for example, which Tasbeha is part of the liturgy, but within the liturgy on Sunday morning, it's almost like you're seeing a window into heaven. Whereas Tasbeha feels like you're sitting in the presence of heaven. Can you maybe briefly explain or briefly bring to remembrance a moment where you kind of felt like that you were really in heaven throughout Tasbeha?
Oh man, I don't know. I like every so often I get that feeling. I mean, sometimes, the person always has to distinguish between themselves, like when they're like kind of an emotional high, sometimes like when the music is just exciting, because that exists. Like there's like an element of emotional kind of connection, but there's another moment where like I call to mind kind of like when St. Paul was talking about the Spirit groans within me, kind of crying out, Abba, Father. And it's not really like intelligent words, but you just feel in your heart that, that I've made connection with God and that God is like, looking at me. And I think it's like hard to quantify and like qualify those moments because they're so personal to each person. Every so often I'll be in Tasbeha, and we'll be singing the Sali, for example, or, the first host or the Theotokia. And for whatever reason, it's not something that I fully understand, that I just will feel extremely engaged. And I would look at God in just like in a very vulnerable state and grow extremely repentant. I don't know. It's such a cool experience. I don't know if you've ever experienced something like that, Isaiah, but it's just like a really, really cool experience when you're sitting there in the awe-inspiring presence of God, and you walk away saying that I felt like God touched me that day. And praise is just like, it can happen in your room, it can happen in church, it can happen in general. I mean, for the most part, midnight praises happens in church, but I know my father would always tell me, like, why don't you, for example, you and your wife to go and sit on a weekday night and just to sit and to praise together. And again, it's like a very, very vulnerable, very engaging moment, whether it's just me and my wife, or it's me and in the congregation, in the church, or sitting in the deacon stand, or anywhere. Yeah.
So you mentioned something about how sometimes hymns give you that emotional feeling of like being present with God versus the spiritual feeling of actually feeling touched by God. So I was wondering maybe if you could go into more detail about the differences between those two feelings and why it's important to have both.
So, I mean, obviously God has given us emotions to be able to engage in like a more engaged process, right? I think what's important to distinguish is that emotions are good and they're helpful. So like, for example, when I'm happy because, maybe Isaiah succeeded in something and I'm happy for Isaiah, like that emotion is good because we engage with each other and we're in communion together, or this like semblance of communion, right? And it gives us an example of how the Trinity is in communion with one another. But when I have emotions and I just vie for that feeling of the emotion, so like I'm just looking for that happiness or that joy, that emotion is fleeting. It doesn't always stay with me. There will be, and I think for this is part of the reason why a lot of people are not they don't enjoy the services that much, is because the Coptic Church isn't just rooted in emotion. The services can be very mundane. Tasbeha is truly the same almost every single day. Yes, there are seasonal differences and things like that, but it's almost the same every single day. And it's not looking just for the emotion. Yes, it is very exciting when we're very emotional. And for example, we get to the Sali and I say, like, I beat my chest saying, "My Lord Jesus Christ, have mercy on me, a sinner," right? Or forgive me, a sinner, or, 7 times every day I will rise and praise your name, right? And I'm very engaged with it emotionally, and we're very excited. Or maybe everyone in the congregation is singing together and we're so engaged. But keeping in mind that that's not what the experience is every single time, right? The emotion is not always going to engage you. I remember when I served high school for quite a bit of time. And I had a very big passion for midnight praises. So I used to Friday nights go and, we'd do the Tasbeha. I say we, but like honestly, sometimes it was just me doing the midnight praises by myself. And I was very passionate about it, but there were some days when there's no one there. It's just me. And I don't know, Isaiah, if you've ever just sung midnight praises by yourself, it's very tiring. You don't get very excited and it beats you down a little bit, but you still do it and you finish it. And so I just kept in that kind of habit. I would go every Friday. Sometimes there'd be people with me. Sometimes there wouldn't. Sometimes people who didn't know midnight praises would be there. Sometimes people who did. So there were some very exciting days and there were some very demoralizing days. And now, thank God, God gave me a nice lesson once I left doing that service. Now the Tasbeha is very exciting. It's a very, very beneficial service. But what that service taught me at that time was that it's not about like necessarily how I feel, but it's about the work that's being done and how I engage with God. Because some of the most precious memories I have are when I was doing that midnight praise on my own. Just standing in front of the presence of God and just, getting raspy voiced and and like telling God, in the first host or in the second host, your mercy endures forever. Just repeating refrain after refrain after refrain. So I think that emotions are helpful and they help to engage me. And sometimes God can use it to help me find benefit in the service. But a lot of times, if you do it enough times, right, like Pope Kyrollos used to pray liturgy every single day. I don't think that Pope Kyrollos was doing it for the sake of how he felt, but for the sake of the work and the transformation that God was doing within him. And I think the reason why those memories were so precious to me was because I felt like God was actively trying to transform me through that process.
The point you just made about God trying to actively transform you, I think is something that we can all relate to for people who attend praises regularly. I know for myself, I have prayed Tasbeha alone before at church. We started a Thursday night Tasbeha every single week. And just like everything else in the church at first, no one really buys into it. And it is a tiring thing. But just like you said, you feel it's not about the emotional feeling you get, but it's about the spiritual feeling you get. You leave those services, and sure, you're tired, sure, you're maybe a little bit down about the fact that no one came, or that you feel like you're not really making a difference. But over time, you look back and you notice the spiritual work that God has done in you and through you. And I think God now has grown into something that, like for example, I'm traveling this week. There's still going to be people there. There's still people that do it, and it's not contingent upon anyone. And it reminds me of the verse like that. God will always find laborers. Even though the harvest is plenty, the laborers are few, but God will still provide. There will still be people to harvest those, to labor in the harvest. And I think a lot of times, not just within praise, but in service in general, we tend to think that the service is dependent on us and is like the service is the beneficiaries from our work, where it's the opposite. We're the beneficiaries of the service's work, and we have the opportunity to partake in it. And I think obviously that's the same thing with Tasbeha. So were there any moments in your life where you felt like that, you were the one that was making Tasbeha go, but looking back on it, you kind of realized maybe that's not the case? And then how do you deal with those thoughts and emotions? And what kind of advice would you give to younger people who are kind of in that situation where they feel like the whole world's dependent on them, but in reality, it's not?
Before I answer that, shout out to Georgia's Tasbehas on Thursday nights. Make sure everyone go, okay? All right? Don't let it fail just because Isaiah leaves 1 week, okay? Okay, so I have a very unique experience with God, and this has never been an issue for me because God has always made it very clear and evident to me that I'm not dependent on that. I feel like every time I was involved in a service and I would start to get puffed up or I'd get very energetic or something like that, and I'd be like, I have to do this. It's all dependent on me. When I was doing the Friday night Tasbehas, I was like, if I'm not there, it's going to fail, things like that. Well, as soon as I left Friday night Tasbehas, I can't tell you how much more successful they've become. And it's very clear to me that I was holding it back. I used to, when I was serving in high school, as soon as I left my Usra, I'm telling you, as soon as I left my Usra, I felt like their zeal and the energy and the things that the project that they were doing in the Usra just expanded. Like they started going on more trips, the outreach was more consistent, they started visiting. Then they literally, the following year, they went on record for being the most zealous class and outreaching their youth. And now in Brunswick, we have like maybe 30 youth in a class. They visited the class 3 times in that year. And that's like unheard of. So I was just like, I was like, okay, God, I get it. It has nothing to do with me. I suck. I'm dust, I'm dirt. It has everything to do with you. So I think that if there are youth that think that the service relies on them, I'll give you an example, not having to do with midnight praises, but rather to do with general service. I remember when I was serving high school, there was a youth who was like very troubled, and I was very consistent in my service. I was very persistent. He would come when I would be there, but if I wasn't really dedicated with him, he like wouldn't come. And so I was very discouraged because after we do high school in 4-year cycles. So after spending 4 years with him, as soon as he graduated from high school, he never showed up, you know? And I was very discouraged. So I was speaking to my Amin al-Khidma, and I was just telling him, I was like, what's the point? Like, what was the point of all my effort? Like, what was the purpose? And then he quoted St. Paul to me and said, you know, it's not about what you do, but it's about the collective effort of the church, right? He also admonished me for not, you know, for being so full of it, first of all, and saying that God is the one who does it. But he was like saying, you know, Paul planted, Apollos watered, but God gave the increase. So the seeds that you plant and the things that you do, maybe a misguided Kyrollos could think that, oh, I planted the seeds of the Mennonite praises and then somebody else watered and then God gave the increase. Yeah, I'm sure that that's what happened. It has really nothing to do exactly with your individual effort, but almost everything to do with the collective effort. But it doesn't mean that we don't still strive and struggle, because the harvest is truly plenty and the laborers are truly few, like you said. So it's this like weird dichotomy where like I must struggle and I must do the things, like I must involve myself in the praises, I must perform them. But it's not about if I don't do it, no one else will do it, but it's for me to take the blessing of the harvest. It's for me to take the blessing of it, because when I was doing those Friday night Tasbehas alone, and I'm sure you can agree with me on the Thursday night Tasbehas, it's it really doesn't, I left those not really caring that people weren't there. But I was so happy with the zeal that God had put in my heart, and how that God had given me the energy to perform that praise alone, had given me the zeal and the energy and the commitment to perform it alone, knowing that maybe a few years ago I wouldn't have done that. I wouldn't have been willing to do that. And now knowing that God is now beginning to build a fountain within me that overflows. You know, Embo Thomas from ECCOIC used to always have this like really great example of like talking about like God's love in us, right? You don't want to be a cup where you just pour water in, right? You want to be a source of the water so that the water overflows. Because if you're half empty, then you can lose all of your water. But if you're overflowing, it doesn't matter how much you spill out. You always have enough for yourself and for all those around you. So that's what I really felt like that midnight praise did for me. It created that source of overflowing water, you know?
The way you talk about the Tasbeha as being like a duty or almost like a work, I think is one of the most important mindsets that an Orthodox Christian can have. It reminds me of like the work of prayer. Like prayer is a work. It's not just a thing you do on the side. And what comes to mind is the book The Way of the Pilgrim, where the premise of the book basically is this pilgrim who does the Jesus prayer everywhere he goes. And that's his work. His work to him is the prayer. And in the same way, as Christians, our work is to praise God. It's our purpose for being put on this earth is to, you know, praise the Creator who created us, you know, and to share that love and share that wealth with the entire world. So I think that distinction that praise is not just a thing you do, or it's not just a thing you do for fun, or it's not a social gathering, but instead it's a work. That's the mindset I think that, you know, through God's inspiration and through his prick of our consciousness to push us to do that, that's how real service is. In the same way how we think of Sunday school, or we think of serving the elderly or serving whoever as a work, as we have to go out and do this. This is not like up to us. It should be the same way with liturgical services, and the same way with Tasbehas and things like that, because I feel like there has to be a purpose for everything we do. So if your purpose is, oh, just for whatever, then when you don't feel like it, you won't do it.
I think that I take a lot of inspiration in this type of concept from like His Holiness Pope Kyrollos, God repose his soul, right? You know, he was like a revolutionary in thought and prayer, and he really changed the structure of the church. He really changed how we thought about everything. I mean, first of all, it was very ironic because everyone thought, not everyone, but many people thought that he was very like a strange. He was a sorcerer. You know, it's so interesting. Someone who's doing miracles, they think is a sorcerer. But I think what I love about Pope Kyrollos, especially if you read some of his writings about prayer, about praise, is it's almost like you feel like Pope Kyrollos is touching into something that I'm like, where is he getting this stuff from, right? Like he's talking about prayer in such like theoretical ways, right? Like prayer is a fountain, you know, prayer is joy, prayer is, you know, worship, prayer is et cetera, right? And so he's just going off about prayer in this like very like kind of mystical way. But the interesting thing about Pope Kyrollos is he's not just a theoretical man. He worked, right, as a monk, as an abunamina, right? All he's doing is he's going into Bethlehem or the Orban room. He's making Orban for the liturgy, or making the holy bread. He's praying the midnight praises. Then he prays the liturgy, and he rinses and repeats that every single day. It doesn't get boring for him. And the very, very interesting thing about it was that if anybody has ever heard a recording of Pope Kyrollos singing the liturgy, I love him, he's my intercessor, but he does not have a voice that's very easy on the ears, right? So Pope Kyrollos teaches us several things, right? The praise is not something that the person who prays, it's not optional. It's a core of the spiritual man's life and the person who prays. And if Pope Kyrollos tells me or says something about prayer or praise, I should take it seriously, because he is the contemporary expert in the Coptic Church. So I think what I love about him was that there was no such thing as an off day. There was no such thing as I'm going to sleep in. And there was no such thing as it being optional, right? He was a very ecclesiastical person. And I think the thing that I want to impart really heavily is that the church is so wise. And the church as our mother really gave us so much that it's a shame if we don't take advantage of every single aspect of it. There are so many different things that the church gave us that for us to not touch into praise or the midnight praises or any type of aspect of worship is a huge shame. And then you can kind of insert this on any praise in the church, right? When we sing the long o'os and ahs and pescha, that's an entirely different aspect of praise. We have a wonderful deacon in Brunswick Church who's really well learned in the hymnology. And I think that people in our generation, Isaiah, I think I'm in your generation. Maybe I'm a little older than you guys, but I think I'm in your generation. But I think that people in our generation, they look at things in the church and they say, is this profitable for me or not? So I can see how liturgy is profitable for me. I can see how a lot of these things are profitable for me, right? Like all the sacraments. But then sometimes when someone gets to the midnight praise or praise in general, they don't see how it's profitable. So it can make someone say, I don't understand how the long hymn is profitable for me. I don't understand how a 4-hour Tasbeha is profitable for me rather than a 1-hour Tasbeha for me, right? Both get the job done, right? But I think that person misses out on the rich heritage of what the church has to offer. I'm sorry, I'm going on for a little bit, but I call to mind a sermon that I heard from Amba Yusuf that was very, very touching. I think it was either the 50 days or the Feast of the Resurrection. I don't remember which church. And Amba Yusuf, His Eminence, was there. And I guess the people there recited a hymn called Kyrollos Zare, which is a longer version of Kyrollos that you don't say in the communion time. And I don't even know if half the people listening will even know this hymn, but it's much longer. It doesn't have the same upbeat tune as the rest of the hymns in the church, but it's very powerful. It's very solemn. It's a very beautiful hymn that we say, and it leads into Onim Nai, and then that leads into a Kalusafuf, which we all know and love, right? Or all you heavenly orders. And I remember listening, and he said, he was basically I felt like he gave a love letter to the church. He was like, thank you so much for singing this hymn, because I hadn't heard this hymn since I was in Der Sorien. And the fact that you're fighting hard to keep the heritage of the church's hymns really touches my heart. And I think that that's something that people, just getting into that aspect of it, is that people don't understand, is that this is a gift and a treasure. Yes, I can finish the midnight praise in an hour, or I can finish it in 4 hours. Do you know what your benefit is when you spend the extra 3 hours? You spend that much longer in prayer. And the church is not even saying, for example, for you to spend a prayer meeting all night. I give a lot of credit to the people who go to these mission trips, or for example, if you've ever been with Mbabulis in Africa, he can do a prayer meeting all night, and I have to give it to him, because when I spend more than 30 minutes in my own personal prayer, I get bored. I can't do it, and I don't know how he has the energy and zeal to do it. Mbabulis is another person who is perfected the art of worship. But what the church does in these longer hymns is it gives you an opportunity to reflect on them. So getting back to what I was saying, there's a deacon in Brunswick who's very well learned in East Brunswick Church. And I remember I was just telling him, I'd never heard the Kyrollos, which is a very long hymn. It's 30, 40 minutes.
Yes.
Yeah, you know it. All right. You only sing it during the midnight praise of Kyrk. And maybe many people have never heard it because there's probably not a lot of people in the church who know it, unless you go to you're doing midnight praise at Ibrahim Mayed. And he happened to know it, this deacon. So I said, could you just sing it? Like, just come, like me and you, like it doesn't really have to be anybody else. Like we can just do a midnight praise, and can you just sing it? Like I've never heard it before, and I don't have any aspirations of learning it because I'm not that well learned. And so he's singing it, and I'm sitting there, and for 5 minutes, I'm like, kind of like, oh, this is long. But then I'm just sitting, and I'm like contemplating on the words of the psalm that's being sung. And I like entered a different space mentally. And then when he ended, there had happened to be some people came in and out, and they were like a little bit bored. But I was sitting there, and I was just listening, and he finished. I was just like, wait, you're done? No, keep going, right? And this is 40 minutes I'm not engaged for. I'm not participating in it. I can't even pick up on the tunes because they keep changing.
Yeah.
I'm not involved at all. But I was sitting there and just taking in what the church is offering to me. And I was thinking in my mind, this is such sublime prayer. I don't have to be actively engaged. Like, I don't feel like it's actively benefiting me because I'm not actively involved, but it is benefiting me. It's engaging me in a spiritual way that I don't understand. So that's a very TLDR, or a very long way to say that I don't have to be actively participating in the praise for me to appreciate it. But of course, it's much better if I am. It's much better if I am. And I would warn all of the youth from our generation to not look for the easy way out. I'm guilty of it. Sometimes if I have to be home early for Sunday liturgy, I'll be like, hey guys, we can do long shere maybe next week, but this week we'll speed through, right? But sometimes it's nice to just sit in prayer and praise with God, knowing that the longer that I spend, the closer that I get to St. Paul's word about praying without ceasing. And trust me when I say this, if you try to engage it, if you try to involve yourself in it directly, you're going to benefit. It's going to be, you're going to be engaged. I think you get what I'm saying when I say this.
It reminds me of a sermon I heard from Abuna Anastasi.
From in New York, right?
New York / Cali / everywhere in the world.
Yes.
And it's a very short sermon. I think it's 2 minutes long. It's on SoundCloud, and it's called On Hymnology. And it's basically about why do we sing all these long hymns. And he says very similar things to what you said about how the spirit of the prayer of these long hymns, it's not for any reason but so that we have an excuse to spend more time with God. We have an excuse to sit in the church and to really, like you said, appreciate and live the words that are being spoken. You mentioned the great hosts, and you mentioned the words. The words are, oh how beloved is your song, or something like that.
I didn't mention it, but I couldn't
starts
remember
with that.
it. So thank you for reminding me.
Oh, sing to the Lord, oh beloved, or something like that.
Probably.
And you realize, like, not even just that. You think of hymns like Esmob Shois or Hos Erof, hymns that really like praise him and exalt him, right? Hos Erof, like that's what it is. And you sit there and you praise him for those 7-8 minutes of however long that hymn is. And like you said, you reflect on it. You're able to transcend this level of human nature almost and live with the heavenly, abide with the heavenly. And it reminds me of the time of the point in the liturgy, which comes from Isaiah 6:9, where we sing the praise of the cherubim and the seraphim. Holy, holy, holy are you, O Lord. And it's, for me, ever since I read that part of the Bible in Isaiah chapter 6, you never look at it the same.
Yeah.
You never look at it the same. And I think that's the same thing with these longer hymns, is that just like everything else in the church, and I feel like these past few days I've been talking about it a lot on this podcast, but there's an elementary way of living it. There's a middle school way, a high school way. It's like a progression, just like everything else in life. So for an example, like talking about loving God, it starts with the fear of God, the fear of hell. Like, why do you serve God? Oh, I'm scared of going to hell. But then it changes and it becomes, oh, because I love the church, I love the hymns. And then it becomes, no, I love my Creator and I want to give my entire being back to Him. The same way with these hymns, I feel like it starts with, oh, I just want to learn it just so like I can sing along with everyone else. And then it becomes, no, I want to really appreciate it so that, because I enjoy it and because it really moves the inside of me. And then I think that the next step, which is a step that I'm working on, is, no, it's because this is the work of God through me. This is me, like giving whatever my Creator has given me back to Him. And I think that's the same thing with, again, like I said, everything in life is that it starts with, a fear, it moves into an appreciation, and then it finally graduates into love. And I think you brought up Pope Kyrollos, obviously, who is the man of prayer, especially in the modern church. And I don't know if you've ever read A Silent Patriarch, but
Of course.
yeah,
It's a great
it
book.
goes without saying.
Shout out.
But in that book, you really get a glimpse of, what prayer really is. It's not, a lot of times we think prayer as, we separate types of prayer. We separate liturgical prayer, we separate personal prayer, we separate Tasbeha, we separate all these things into different categories almost in our mind. But what it is, all at the end of the day, is the work of God in us. It's the way how we communicate with our Creator, which I think praise is one of those ways as well. So I wanted to delve a little bit deeper into Tasbeha itself, and talk about the maybe significance of some of the, because we're talking about the words and significance of those words. What are some words within Tasbeha? I know you mentioned, my Lord Jesus Christ, forgive me a sinner, but what are some words within Tasbeha that, maybe recently in your life have held such a greater value, or have held such an, throughout different seasons of your life, different things hold different values. So what is something maybe now that you, when you get to that part in Tasbeha, you're like, man, that's really talking to me today?
Oh, okay.
Or in like this season of life, but yeah. So I didn't mean to put you on the spot right there. But.
No, it's a good question. You're right. I think in every season of your life, there's like lots of different hymns. So like, there's some times when I was just, a huge fan of Third Host, right? Everyone has that phase. It's like the most engaging. It's the most upbeat. Or Ipsalin, or O Sing Unto Him Who Was Crucified, right? Sometimes every so often, we get very excited about the hymn like Tinen. Even if we can't sing it very well, we get very excited. I think that recently, I wouldn't say recently, maybe the past 4 or 5 years, I've had a much greater appreciation for St. Mary in our faith, and like her involvement in the economy, right? And I think like this is also something that was kind of lost on me as a youth, because the Coptic Church has a really, really great love for St. Mary. They love St. Mary so much. And, to the point where like my mom and some other like people in my family, they'll be like, just pray to St. Mary, man. It'll all get taken care of. Like, don't worry about the rest of the saints. If you pray to St. Mary, it'll get taken care of. So I think I've had a really great appreciation for the Theotokias that the church has, and the solis that are associated with the Theotokias. There's this like really great video on YouTube and some like Arabic website of this like really great servant from church, and from the church in Egypt, and I don't know his name. I wish I did. And he talks about the praise as this like journey, and he'll talk about how the Sunday soli is different from the Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, etc., etc. And then talking about like the Theotokias too, and what kind of we delve on. I don't know if you've ever like really sat and like looked at the Theotokias, but to get theological for a second, right? The object of St. Mary not being the mother of God was a major concern for a long period of time. We take it for granted, right? This has probably been beat to dust, right? But there was this like recent speaker, on TikTok that got very famous, Mari Emmanuel, right? And there was like a whole big thing of some people saying like, oh, he's not Coptic, even though some people thought he did. And he would make some comments about, St. Mary not being the mother of God, right? And I had such an intense appreciation for the Coptic Church because, the church didn't pander to a very intellectual audience for a long time, right? Everyone in the Coptic Church probably got educated within the past 100 years. But before then, vast majority probably were illiterate or didn't read or write very well, right? I mean, the first person who really started to normalize ecclesiastical and even academic teaching and education was Pope Kyrollos V back in the late 1800s, right? Yeah. So before then, you have no idea what's going on, right? And, if you read Silent Patriarch, you're talking about a church that before then, there's a lot of simony, there's a lot of corruption, things like that we didn't really talk about, right? Because it's just not a good look. But we're talking about a church that, for the most part, maybe after the Arab invasion in the 600s, right? Maybe didn't have a lot of good education. The Library of Alexandria was burned. Like, Alexandria is not really a hub anymore, or if it is a hub, it's a hub for bad things and not good things. And so the church is trying to teach its congregation how to adhere to the faith as best as possible. It's fitting that we're talking about this type of thing with St. Athanasius' feast that just passed yesterday. And I was reading something from like a very knowledgeable deacon in our church, right? It wasn't St. Athanasius that really, really fought for the faith, right? Or it was, but he was very courageous. But it was the Coptic people themselves who knew what was wrong and what was right,
Mm.
who rejected the wrong teachings and the false teachings. To anybody who's listening and says, this is all kind of a bit dramatic, I would urge you to reconsider that, because what you believe immediately dictates your faith and your worship. And so what the Coptic Church did is a part of the worship, it built in these Theotokias about St. Mary, so that I can understand how St. Mary is involved in the economy of salvation, right? How she birthed Emmanuel, the God, like God himself, right? And how she's involved in that, right? And how she became the bearer of the forerunner of humanity, right? That through St. Mary, she is the gateway. She is the door for humanity to enter into heaven. Without St. Mary, we could never ever even approach the door, right? And when you start to understand those things properly, not only do you get an appreciation for the Theotokias, you get a greater appreciation for St. Mary. And it's very easy for me to hear something like from someone who's so charismatic as Mari Emmanuel, and to say that, no, I don't agree with that thought about St. Mary, that's incorrect. And I can never be, stumbled or, led astray in that regard, that she is truly the Mother of God, that her womb was sanctified, that she gave birth to the Logos himself in a mystery that we celebrate every year in Christmas on the Incarnation, right? Of the Logos himself, the second person of the Trinity. That in itself gives me an appreciation for St. Mary as my, right, I quote Father Anthony Paul so many times in his sermons, he says, is my mother, right? Is mama, he'll say sometimes, or some of the other saints have said, right? My mother, right? But I can't have that appreciation for St. Mary as my mother, right? Because she is the mother of Christ, who I take communion, so I am in Christ, and so she is my mother, right? In this mysterious way. I can't have appreciation for St. Mary unless I've praised the Theotokias, right? And I understand the theology, and I know who St. Mary is theologically and personally,
Mm-hmm.
right? There's, for example, like Father Lazarus in St. Anthony's Monastery, right? If you ask him about St. Mary, he'll go off. He'll go off. He loves her so much. That's his mother, right? And it's not just because of some type of miraculous things that happened associated with her, but because he truly sees her as his mother in a mysterious way, and that he has that connection with her. And it's only through God himself that we can have that connection. So again, a very long way to say that the Theotokias have been like an object of interest for me, especially recently with this like dialogue that's been happening more abruptly with this president of this like very charismatic speaker. And to know that the church is so like mindful of me personally, right? Like it's not just mindful of the bishops as the priests who like know all of these things, but it's mindful of the individual, right? Because I think in the vast majority of churches, right, it's not the priests who are leading the midnight praises, right? It's the laymen and laywomen, right? The mothers and fathers, the sons and daughters, right? The babies, the old men and women who are all just praising God individually, knowing their faith, internalizing it. And you don't need to give me a dissertation on the, Nestorian heresy or why St. Mary is the Mother of God, but you know within your heart that she is the Mother of God, and that as a result, she is your mother as well. And so if anybody comes to you with an odd idea, you're able to say, that doesn't sound right. That's not correct, right? Because the church has taught me since my youth what is right and what's wrong, right? And there is right and there is wrong. They wouldn't have an entire section of the Midnight Praise, or they wouldn't have devoted so much time of my praise and my worship and my singing if it wasn't incredibly important, But let me ask you, Isaiah, what's something that you've been meditating on recently?
So it's very funny that you say the Sunday or the Theotokias, because for me specifically, it's been the same thing. That is since this entire day I've been stuck in Toi and Hikanos, the 10 through 15th Sunday Theotokia.
It's a very exciting hymn. It's really cool.
It's been stuck in my mind, and it's to be honest, I think for me it's been just like you said. It's such the theological importance of that hymn, or of all the Theotokias, but specifically those 5, or how it likens the Old Testament to the New Testament. It really creates that bridge of showing that the Old Testament really points to Christ and points to St. Mary as the Mother of God, and that it wasn't just something that was made up or some sort of contemplation that some church father gave, but truly she is the Mother of God. I think for me that has extreme weight, especially like you said with the things that are going on very recently with all the theological differences about like you said. And to be honest, it's that hymn holds such a high value for me, especially because I go to a church. I go to St. Mary in Atlanta, and so there's something about praising the mother of God because you're praising Christ. You know, a lot of times, especially with other churches, they come and they tell us that, you know, we worship St. Mary. Not true, obviously.
No.
You know, we worship Christ, but because St. Mary is so important to that, like you said, that economy of our salvation, we have to give her due praise, her due glory, her due veneration. So I agree 100%. I mean, it's kind of funny. I think we said the same thing. And I know as my life has moved, it's been completely different. I remember for me in early high school, when I started going to Tasbeha, it was the Apsalis. It was, Ikoti and Sok, I sought after you. You know, my Lord Jesus Christ, forgive me. My Lord Jesus Christ, forgive me. Because that was, for me, that was a transformative few years of my life where I went from feeling astray from the church to really taking my faith seriously and really putting Christ on my sleeve. You know, really putting my faith on. But then now, you know, it's kind of changed into, you know, I feel like, especially with what I do on this podcast, it's more of a, you know, like there's a theological value to the Theotokias, and there's a theological value to, you know, of importance that I have to, you know, keep in mind whenever I do these things. So I agree 100%, and I think that's why the Theotokias are so vastly important, and that's why, in general, I think praise is important, because it takes, like you said, within Tasbeha, the Coptic Church, that was a teaching method. For thousands of years, that was a teaching method. Sunday school wasn't a thing until the late 1800s, honestly, early 1900s, when Habib Girgis really put it into movement. So, you know, like, how did these people learn? How did these people know? It was through the church services. The church has all of its wisdom in it. And that's the beauty of the Coptic Church, is that it wasn't made for intellectuals. It wasn't made for astronomers or for astrophysicists. It was made for the weak, the simple, the people who didn't know anything. That's who it was made for. And I think with the story that comes to mind is the story of the bishop who went to the island. There were these farmers on the island, and all they know how to pray was, "Oh Lord, have mercy on me." That's it. And so he tried to teach them Our Father. And he kept going back and forth the whole day, and he says, "Okay, I have to go." And then the farmer comes running back to him right before he leaves and goes, I forgot what comes after Our Father. And so the bishop was just like, "It's okay, just do whatever you're doing then." Because at the end of the day, like, the words, and obviously they're important, and obviously all of the praises and all of the hymns and all of the stuff is important. But at the end of the day, it's the spirit and the simplicity of the individual that makes that difference. It's the simplicity that really shows that the faith that's inside of them.
Sorry, I have to just add one point to the story, and what makes the story so funny is that when the bishop was leaving, he had already gotten on his boat and he was sailing away.
Yeah.
And so in the story, the peasant comes in, or the farmer or whatever, running on the water. He's like, "What happens?" And he's like, "Just do whatever you're doing. Whatever you're doing is fine." So yeah, you're right. I think the simplicity is so important, and I think that it's so important to say about it is now to communicate it, because the generation above us, I think, was much simpler than we are, and I think we in our generation feel like we're smarter, right? I think that 100% is the case. I have so many times that I felt like I knew something better, and I think it's a disease of youth, right? I think it's a disease of youth that we always think that we're better than the generation before us, that we're smarter, especially with all the technological advances and things like this in this age. It's like so easy to make that distinction, but we don't know that much. And in the light of God, who is the creator of all and omniscient, I know absolutely nothing. So there's more of an importance for me to say that I don't know. And I need to sit here and be simple and to humble myself, right? I think there's a lot of people who want to place things on God or place constrictions around God. It's funny, the person who taught me this was my organic chemistry professor in college. He was Protestant, right? And absolutely nothing to do with orthodoxy. But he would always tell me, he was like, God is unlimited. Do not place him in a box of your own making, thinking that he should act in the way that you want him to. Saying that I shouldn't praise for this long, or I should praise for that long, or God needs this, or God needs that. I put more stock, personally, in the church as an entity who for 2,000 years has been guiding believers and creating saints like Pope Kyrollos, and before him, all of the saints that exist in our lineage. I put more stock in what that church thinks is good for me, rather than what I think myself, Kyrollos Zare, who was born 95, not even a fraction of the length of the church or the time since Christ preached. it's such a good, like, just coming and sitting and thinking, like, in the presence of God, thinking that I know absolutely anything is such a concept. There's nothing that you could say or nothing that you could do. And I always, when I was being taught as a child, right, what's so much better than my own words, right? Like, when you're a kid, what do you say? Oh, God, heal the sick, pray for the people in the hospital, let those who didn't come this week come next week, right? When I'm praying Tasbeha, I koti and sok, I sought after you, right? Or in the first hos, tote of hos, in J. Moises, right? Like, I'm quoting the words of the Bible themselves, right? Or some of the enlightened thinkers like Sarkis, right? For the Arab Saline. Or like some people like indicate when I'm singing monogenes in Pescha, right? There's been some conflict about this, but right, like whether it's Athanasius or Severus, right? We're taking words from people who are truly enlightened or from the words of the Bible themselves. Do I really think that my words are going to be better than that? No way.
Yeah.
You got 2,000 years of history and divine enlightenment that's back in one end, and then you got, some scrubby kid like myself back in the words on this end. So it's a no-brainer. If a person has to think whether or not I should praise or not, or whether I should be attending midnight praises, or if I should be listening to the hymns or be singing along, it's a no-brainer. Whatever you are going to provide is not going to be more substantial than what the church can provide to you in your place. Again, I'm not saying anything about those who have I'm speaking as a weak person who has a weak relationship with God and who must rely on the aid of the church. But I think I speak on, like, in the perspective of most youth who maybe, they don't have the zeal to spend 12 hours in prayer nonstop. It's just not, it's not there. So having like a crutch is really, really helpful. Yeah.
Beautifully said. That's all I have for you today.
Thank you, Isaiah.
Are there any last words you want to say? Anything else you want to say?
No, I think I talked a lot.
That's a good thing.
Or in my sister's perspective, I yap a little bit too much. I think that if I had to say anything just about midnight praises, is it's much better than you think. Give it its fair share. And not just midnight praises, but the alhan and the hymnology. And it is never too late to learn. It is never too late to sit and learn, because like Revelations indicates to us, these hymns are the things that we're going to be singing in heaven. So whether you learn now or whether you learn in heaven, you might as well start now.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Dr. Kyrollos, for coming onto the podcast. It's been a blessing and a pleasure, and we'll definitely have you on in the future. Thank you guys for watching. Make sure to like, comment, subscribe, turn on post notifications. See you guys next week. Thank you.